Today we're going to go beyond the headlines of the PACT Act to talk about burn pit exposure outside of Iraq and Afghanistan. So most veterans, and honestly most Americans at this point, have heard about the massive burn pits that were used in the Second Gulf War, particularly the one at Joint Base Balad, which burned hundreds of tons of waste daily for years on end. And so burn pits, though, are not unique to the Second Gulf War. Anecdotally, we've heard story from clients and potential clients about burn pits, and veterans have reported their use and disposal of trash, medical waste, fuel, chemicals in locations across the world, from Vietnam to the Balkans to the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, that's right. So the reality is that burning trash is a long-standing operational practice. So we, as you mentioned, we have firsthand accounts from veterans from Vietnam, even smaller operations. And per a recent GA report, VA said that additional data on the extent of veteran exposures is, we need more medical research for that before we know what the actual consequences of these exposures are. And that data doesn't exist yet.
Right. So let's talk about that GAO report, because that really was the impetus for our discussion today. So burn pits, burn barrels, and burnout latrines are an easy way for deployed troops to get rid of waste. That can include plastics, chemicals, vehicle parts, food waste, medical waste, even human waste. And the difference between what was used maybe operationally in the past and the Second Gulf War scale. So as I mentioned, the Balad Air Base in Iraq had one of the largest burn pits ever operated by the U.S. military, burning hundreds of tons of material for days, for years on end. We've all seen those pictures of just this huge pit of garbage on fire, soldiers driving bulldozers, moving the burning garbage around. And it created that very dense black smoke that contained dioxins, volatile organic compounds, and heavy metals.
Yeah. So we all know about the burn pits in Southwest Asia, but the earlier burn pits like those that were used in Vietnam were much smaller, but they often burned similar toxic materials, and there was less environmental understanding and therefore less environmental control. And the other problem with some of these earlier burn pits is that there were less record keeping at that point. So VA has historically recognized the Gulf War burn pits because there's such good records from the DoD. But for those earlier conflicts like the Balkans and Vietnam, there's just not a lot of documentation. So instead, veterans have to rely on their lay statements, their buddy statements, and some base level reports to show exposure, which is pretty difficult, but not impossible. So there is a Marine Corps training document from the Vietnam era that warned about burnout latrines generating excessive air pollution that was detrimental to the health of the personnel in the immediate area. And that was confirmed by the GAO report about veterans' exposure to open air burning. So you just have to find the evidence.
Right. And so the PACT Act created presumptive service connection for over 20 respiratory and cancer conditions tied to burn pit exposure. But those presumptions only apply to veterans who served in specific Gulf War and post 9/11 locations. And so, for toxic exposure presumptions, it's all about time, location, and condition. You got to meet those three things, and then you get the presumption. So veterans outside those regions or with conditions not on the presumptive list can still file claims. You can always file a claim. Anything due to service should be service-connected. That's, in the regulations, in the statute. But you have to prove the traditional elements of service connection with a current diagnosis, evidence of exposure during service, and a medical nexus connecting the two.
Yeah, so that's the key point, because when exposure is not presumed, VA examiners will often say, well, there's no documented evidence of exposure, and so we can't give you a nexus opinion. And that leads to denials, obviously. So, for example, if a veteran was stationed in Africa in the 1990s and developed bronchitis or a rare cancer, they need to, one, show that they worked near an open burn pit, and then they'll need a strong medical opinion linking that illness to that environmental exposure from the burn pit. So we're thinking medical research, environmental reports, expert statements. Those are the types of evidence that can strengthen the claim even without that presumption. So veterans and their representatives, again, sometimes it's really helpful to have somebody on your side. They can help identify and gather that evidence, like declassified records, photographs, and even firsthand accounts from other veterans.
That's right. And, VA has been increasingly open to conceding exposure where credible evidence supports it. One of the features of the PACT Act are those TERA exams and TERA concessions. So when a veteran is exposed to a toxic element, VA is supposed to be conceding in the rating decision in the favorable findings of fact whether or not you were exposed. And that could be anything from maybe a burn pit, but also, you used benzene, you were exposed to jet fuel, use TCE in cleaning, computer equipment. So those things are making it a little hair bit easier. But one of the biggest hurdles, of course, is that VA has not specifically conceded what toxins or what chemicals earlier burn pits were churning out. We can make some guesses based on what we know from the air reports above Balad. But without that recognition from VA, medical nexus opinions may get discounted.
And until the presumptions are created, veterans or their representatives really need to emphasize that lay statements are enough and logical inference is enough. If you testify that you remember burning plastic, we know what happens when plastic is burned.
Right.
And so you sometimes need to connect those dots. But especially when burn pits are a known operational method, that should be enough in certain circumstances to get over that hurdle of not having a presumption. There's also precedent for considering reports of environmental hazards when military records are incomplete. So that's something that comes up a lot in Agent Orange and radiation cases, and you can apply it to burn pits as well.
That's right. So advocacy from veterans and from veterans representatives are really important as we go forward with these. As VA continues to study toxic exposures under the PACT Act, there's always the possibility that new burn pit locations could be added. There's nothing on the horizon right now. Just want to be clear about that, but there's a possibility. And it could include, extending the presumptions to veterans who are exposed in those locations. And it could also potentially include survivors' benefits, which was a really key feature of the PACT Act.
Yeah, and it's important to note that Congress has directed VA to keep reviewing scientific data on these hazards beyond Southwest Asia. So to your point, well, nothing's on the horizon right now. Science is always evolving, always changing. And so the more information we know, we may see more burn pit related conditions recognized for maybe Vietnam or Cold War veterans. You just never know. There's also a working group that's central to this process. So the Open Burn Pit Registry is part of that. And so veterans should register even if they're not covered by the current presumption list. If they were exposed to burn pits, you should register for that burn pit list because you never know. That could continue to drive policy further. It could continue to build evidence. The more people are registered, the more data VA will have.
That's right. I think going into this, when you and I first looked at this topic, I knew about the Burn Pit Registry for Gulf War veterans, and I know that they're automatically included. But as you said, anyone can register. So if you were exposed to burn pits at any point in service, register. Go ahead. Tell them about the exposure. Have a doctor take a look at your medical conditions, and that can only help. The more data points VA has, the more likely we'll be able to move this issue forward. So the final bottom line is that burn pit exposure is not just a Gulf War issue. It's decades-long global issue that's affected veterans of multiple generations. So even if your service doesn't fall under a presumptive location or presumptive condition, it's worth pursuing a claim if you can gather that credible evidence that we talked about. Veterans shouldn't assume they're excluded just because their deployment was earlier or outside Iraq and Afghanistan. And with the PACT Act, VA has really opened the door to a broader discussion about environmental exposure amongst veterans.